to see you back, Susanna. Thanks for joining us again today.
My pleasure.
To resume this conversation. So let's get into it.
Yeah, let's get into it. So last time we talked a lot about the challenges that NGOs face in non-permissive environments and dealing with combatants and mines and all sorts of horrific things. Can you deep dive a little bit more into some of those situations that you've experienced?
Well, just in relation to my experiences that are playing out now again in Gaza, I see some of that being replicated again. And, it's tragic because, lives are at stake here, the lives of these relief workers who are wonderful people, best of intentions. And, of course, the other side of this equation is how militaries deal with it too. So last time I showed you the footage of at the Australian Army trying to come to grips with food distribution, and it went horribly wrong the first time round. And we learned that lesson and actually did learn the lesson and actually then adopted better approaches to how we managed food distribution points and worked more closely in collaboration with NGOs. So that tightness of that relationship had to be there. So questions of impartiality and neutrality, they kind of, they go out the window if you need to get people food and save people's lives and protect them. And so sometimes you do have to understand you're working with an organisation that's going to, whose objective is to be there to deliver a better outcome from a security point of view. So I think one situation that really everyone's aware of kind of surfaces the both sides of this issue, where the military maybe not doing things as well as they can, needing to learn lessons, and the NGOs creating some complexity themselves and having some issues associated with that. So that World Central Kitchen issue was dealt with in detail with the Special Advisors report that the government appointed. And they put former Air Chief Marshal, former Chief of the Defence Force, Mark Binskin, in charge of that report. And it really is important to read that report in detail. There's been a failure to really consider the detail of that report, and it's so important to understand targeting issues and NGO issues. And so I'll surface some of the extracts here from that report and show people that now. So when you see the reference to the CLA, that's the Civilian Liaison Organisation that the IDF has in place to work with NGOs. So this is the issue that the World Central Kitchen found themselves in relation to armed guards.
Okay.
And originally they'd had a policy where they weren't going to have armed guards, and certainly the CLA had made it very clear, and as reported by Air Chief Marshal Binskin, that when they're normally coordinating these things and someone then raises the issue with them of having armed guards, then they would have denied that request because it just makes them get too hard in the circumstances to sometimes distinguish. And so, that was the first issue, and it was very hard to unravel that. And I don't think Mark was able to get to the bottom of exactly how it happened that the World Central Kitchen had hired armed guards to protect this particular movement when the incident happened of relief materials. So you had, weapons clearly observed by IDF assets, surveilling the environment and seeing these armed guards behaving like Hamas had in their operations in looting relief materials, and we'll come back to that point, and firing into the air, etc., and having weapons really raised the situation immediately that, my God, this is not, a relief activity. This is Hamas moving around and needing to be dealt with and neutralized. And Mark has said that, look, not carrying weapons on WCK and their previous experience with contracting local security, that was supposed to be their policy that they weren't going to do that. And Mark wasn't able to determine how it happened that this contracting situation occurred. And also he couldn't rule out that WCK had inadvertently contracted security for their aid convoy with an entity that had links to Hamas. So, and you can imagine that's going to be a big ask for how is an NGO going to vet these people? How is an NGO going to determine that that person isn't an actual Hamas fighter or associated with Hamas. How does that work? You can't expect an NGO to be able to do that. So that's an
I
important.
can't even imagine how they would.
Well, exactly. No capacity to do it, right?
You'd have to have like really deep dive intelligence to be able to determine civilian population from Hamas operatives.
Well, it would put more onus on you to cooperate with the security authorities, with the IDF, to try and work that out. But that's why the IDF would never approve that.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So this is, important information that Mark had surfaced here in the report. And on the military side, there was also a compounding of what they were doing incorrectly based on and what the World Central Kitchen was doing, in a way that kind of compromised what they were doing because of the lack of communications, real-time communications. So it wasn't possible for the IDF to communicate directly with the World Central Kitchen vehicles and operators on the ground. They were passing messages back through the headquarters of the World Central Kitchen in America to try and, get resolve situation on the ground. So, this was a really serious, and I mentioned with the ICRC, the way they're operating in Gaza, they'll have their transponders on the roof, they'll have their communications in the vehicles that, both the IDF can reach, or central communications point for the ICRC on the ground locally will be able to make sure that passage of information is happening quickly. But the ICRC will also impose far greater discipline on movements. So one of the situations that occurred here was that the movement that World Central Kitchen was involved in was meant to happen in daylight. And that makes it what makes it possible to identify the vehicle as a World Central Kitchen vehicle, because those markings they have are not visible at night.
Tragic.
So, and with the ICRC, as a contrast again, they'll have the great big flag on the back and it's very easy to understand what they're doing, but they wouldn't be moving anyway without the IDF knowing what they're doing. And if they couldn't do it, then they wouldn't make that movement until they'd made alternative arrangements. So in this situation, the World Central Kitchen decided to push ahead and do the movement at night. They'd been delayed. It was intended to be done during the daytime, and the movement wasn't exactly as they'd advised the CLA in terms of what they were doing. So that state of confusion also created the conditions in which, the terrible outcome occurred. And so, there's no question, as Mark surfaced, that the presence of these armed, locally contracted security really gave the appearance of the presence of Hamas, the failure within the IDF to ensure proper dissemination of coordination details of WCK movements through all the tactical levels was also contributed to this. So there's that, that situation where the military has got to understand how deeply they have to and closely they have to work with NGOs. And so it makes it ridiculous when you come up with this ability or this claim or this intent to separate yourselves. It can't happen in this sort of environment. You must be as closely linked and coordinated as you possibly can be. So this commentary I hear about humanitarian principles is quite ridiculous in this situation. The humanitarian principle is getting food into people's mouths. That's the principle that should be applied. So Mark surfaced that communications issue is so super important, as I personally experienced. And really that would have eliminated this situation if it had been in place. So that's basically the situation emerging from Mark's report that sort of brings back from my experience in 1993 all the way forward to here we are in 2025. You're still getting this NGO experience, and of course World Central Kitchen wasn't around then.
I guess you'd really see the patterns as well with your experience. You'd be able to recognize instantly probably
it's frustrating.
Some of those behaviours. Yeah.
So if I was in there, I'd be saying, where's our Civil Military Operations Centre and road movement plans and coordination activities and liaison officers, etc., and and insisting on standards of communication capability to ensure that communications happen rapidly. So I hope that we're starting to say, this has got to happen, right?
Yeah, the lessons learned. So Can you maybe go into a little bit more about the relationship with UNRWA with Hamas in the Gaza Strip?
Yeah, it's kind of shocking to have to say that, that UNRWA has an association with Hamas. And that situation actually has kind of deep roots and on many levels. And I think one of the most important ones, and, we'll talk about this, in relation to the history of the Gaza conflict, but the situation of their involvement with education, for example, they run schools in Gaza. And it's been reported on several times by the European Union and the European Parliament. They've had 5 different reports on the situation of UNRWA's activities in education in Gaza, and they've spelled it out. That they've called the materials that are perpetuating or indoctrinating, the kids from the earliest possible ages, trying to prepare them to be martyrs and fighters, and to be able to do inhumane and inhuman things, because you've dehumanized and othered a certain other category of person, in this case the Jews and Israelis. But it doesn't stop there, because their materials talk about all infidels, really, and you'll see imagery of infidels burning in the fires of hell, and etc. So the European Union said that it's the problematic and hateful contents encouraging violence, spreading anti-Semitism, and including hatred in Palestinian school textbooks drafted by European Union-funded civil servants, as well as in supplementary education materials developed by UNRWA staff and taught in its schools, was just unacceptable. But those are the words they used to describe it. And, and then last year in April of 2024, they actually just flat out joined the dots with what happened on October the 7th. And, we can't deny the extent of the savagery that happened at that moment. And so what they said about that was that in the context of the despicable terrorist attacks carried out by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023, education to hatred has direct and dramatic consequences on the security of Israelis, as well as on the perspectives and prospects of a better future for young Palestinians. Mm-hmm. So this is one dimension of the UNRWA equation and Hamas. The other is very practical. So Hamas has made great use of UNRWA facilities to draw power, to use to mask activities, to, in the context post-October 7th, Israeli hostages were held in UNRWA facilities at times.
And this is a UN agency.
A UN agency, and it's unquestioned. There is video footage of people who are employed by UNRWA engaging in the activities on October the 7th.
It's horrific.
Participating as part of that savagery. So deeply, deeply compromised. And then it comes down, and we come back to the situation of the looting of materials. UNRWA certainly hasn't stood in the way of that happening. And this is the serious issue when we come back to, we mentioned last time, Article 23 of the 4th Geneva Convention, that it's legitimate for a power who is in a position of controlling access to relief to put in place measures to stop that relief material being used by the enemy to further their goals and to enhance their capability. So the way Hamas is operating in Gaza, having had, the Rafah crossing closed off, etc., they've lost the access they had to the vast sums of money coming from Iran, etc., and weapons supplies.
Okay.
All of that, Iran orchestrating and supporting. So what they've resorted to has been large-scale looting of relief materials, which they then use to raise revenue. And it's, no one knows the precise amount, but it's a large sum of money, maybe as much as, say, $200 million, for example. I've seen one figure cited, but certainly a lot of money to continue their efforts. And at the same time, because they feel they're not going away, they're going to be here forever. So, they'll build their sinews of war again based on revenue they'll get from anywhere, including raising it locally. And in the past, they raised a lot of money, huge sums, from imposing taxes on material coming through their tunnels from Egypt, etc., or crossing the borders. So,
and the UN's funded internationally massive amounts of money going into that agency and then being misused.
yes, and that's led a lot of countries now to freeze their funding or suspend it. A lot of European countries now, European Parliament has frozen funding to Palestinian Authority in relation to the education materials. So there's been an understanding, I think that's happening. But this UNRWA practical contribution is been heinous in relation to standing by quite, happily to see Hamas redirect these relief materials for their financial benefit. And it means that the population aren't getting the flow of relief that they deserve. They've certainly been able to buy back materials that have been looted or get access to some materials that Hamas hasn't actually looted.
They pay the ultimate price.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of killing of Gazans by Hamas in the process of, Hamas with the facilitation of UNRWA, in this process of looting.
That's just crazy.
Yes, it's part of the tyranny that Hamas has imposed on Gaza for the last 18 years. And during every break that's occurred in the fighting, they will wheel out large groups of Gazans to execute, to torture, to even dissect and throw off roofs. Repeatedly, that's been going on.
Terrific. And all with the legitimacy of the United Nations umbrella.
Well, just, turning a blind eye, and we're not seeing it being reported and even in our mainstream media here. And the protests that now we've seen from Gazans against Hamas, calling for them to go away, lay down your arms, relieve us from this situation. The statements that even the Palestinian Authority leadership have made in relation to Hamas, Mahmoud Abbas calling them sons of dogs, get out of the way, stop imposing, this suffering on Gazans, the Global Imams Council. There's been multiple calls for Hamas to lay down their arms, release the hostages, get out of the way.
It would be over.
Instantly.
It would instantly
as
be
we
over.
speak here, it will all be over. And they started this war and they've perpetuated it because that's what they're about, perpetual war, and using it as a political propaganda tool. So we haven't seen, for example, interviews where Hamas officials have stated, well, this is what we're about. Buildings can be rebuilt. And as for people being killed, they're martyrs, and that's what we want. And already one of them specifically sat there in front of a camera and said, there's been 50,000 children born to replace the martyrs we've lost. So our strength is in the wombs of our women, literally saying these things.
It's awful.
So this is the situation you're in that the NGOs have to realise and accept and understand has to be resolved. So part of the issue here is creating a secure space to deliver relief is important, but also to enable, Gazans to put their hands up and assert themselves, have their voices heard, be free to speak out against Hamas, and potentially then be involved in forming local governance to move on from all this. So that's the issue around UNRWA and Hamas, and the dynamics that we're seeing play out there before we've seen new strategies adopted is unacceptable. And so if
I think that's an understatement of the century, isn't it?
Yes, and so I don't understand the commentary from either NGOs or the UN. The UN particularly has been incredibly heinous in all this because effectively their statements have been that they don't want to support Israel's military objective of eliminating Hamas from Gaza, which means you're actually supporting a terrorist organisation listed as a terrorist organisation in Australia and multiple countries. And you're saying you're on their side effectively.
Well, you have to ask how deep those ties go if you have UNRWA workers involved in the invasion of Israel on October 7th and holding hostages. How deep is that connection all under this umbrella of a legitimate humanitarian organisation?
Yeah, well, it's the three dots, right? The therefore part. Okay, so the therefore part is really at UNRWA. As much as Hamas can be no part of a Palestinian governance, and that's what the Palestinian Authority will tell you, that they don't want Hamas and it's our government's policy not to accept Hamas as part of a Palestinian government. If that's your conclusion, then the other, therefore, is that UNRWA is not the agency you want to be part of relief or reconstruction. So, and I've called for the establishment of a new international regime or structure to deliver that, where we have confidence in where the money's going, because a lot of money that's gone into UNRWA has also found its way into Hamas's coffers and building their sinews of war. So we have to be reassured about that it's not, that the corruption and the levels of corruption of Hamas for personal gain have been enormous. So a survey conducted by the Arab Monitor organization, which amazingly was completed on the 6th of October 2023, showed that the vast majority of Gazans resent Hamas, believe it's thoroughly corrupt, understand and know how corrupt it is, and want to move on from them. So we have to come up with a construct where we can have surety around, like Australian taxpayer dollars, for example, going to help Palestinians. It's my fervent desire to see them properly supported, for us to actually build a future for them, but that can't happen under Hamas and certainly not under UNRWA the way it's constructed.
So, Mike, what do we know of the objectives of the IDF's organisation, Operation Gideon's Chariots?
Yeah, I think this has been really positive sign, actually, of the IDF being more forceful in policy considerations at the moment. And it really reflects our experience in Iraq, the lessons we learned, which should have been lessons understood from, counterinsurgency theory from long ago. But in Iraq, in the period around 2016-17, we started 2006, 2007, I should say. You started seeing an adjustment of strategy because it was accepted we were in a counterinsurgency situation, and the strategy became what they called seize, hold, build. So, and that is the policy now that the IDF wants to pursue to finally bring the Gaza situation to resolution. So that involves you actually seize ground and then you hold it. And what we've seen up until now is the IDF just moves through, conducts operations, engages with Hamas, and then, sort of will pull back, and then eventually has to go back in again because Hamas will move around tunnels and buildings, etc. So it's kind of not getting to an end state anytime soon. So seizing ground, holding it so that you can actually properly neutralize any threat within that ground, and then building on that foundation. And so what you do in building on that foundation is a number of things. So the first thing, the biggest priority, is you enable a secure space for humanitarian relief to take place in. And then you can start looking at who you can work with locally, where you can actually provide surety around safety of the civilians so they don't have to be moved around from that location again. So we can move beyond this point where you're continually having to warn civilians to move from this location to that. And, up until now, the IDF's had a matrix of blocks in Gaza where they'll indicate to the population, you have to move from here to there.
Yep.
And so we want to break that cycle, So this is actually a good strategy. Seize, hold, build, and then create that safe space for both humanitarian relief and for, the delivery of, a future for the Palestinians in terms of safety to speak up, safety to organise.
Yeah, instead of just creating a vacuum for Hamas to come back into.
Exactly. I guess democracy and good governance abhors a vacuum, but, the enemy also has a vote in these things, and they abhor a vacuum too, and they love filling a vacuum. And so that's what they will do. Yeah. Ungoverned spaces are where terrorist organizations flourish, like we saw with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And we saw in Somalia, that's that you want to deny them those spaces. It's classic counterinsurgency theory.
Build something for good instead.
Yes.
So what about Gaza Humanitarian Foundation?
Yeah, interesting story that. So this is the attempt to sidestep UNRWA and to create a more secure and organised method of delivering relief that doesn't get looted and doesn't get turned to the benefit of the enemy. We noted the legal ground for that. the question then is, how is it effective? Is it effective? And how you can make adjustments to make it effective. So clearly, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has mainly been a project of the US and Israeli governments to achieve that result. It's well funded in that respect. And, it will bring with it the security elements directly associated with that relief, not military. They're looking to private contractors to provide the immediate location security.
And they're vetted in the US?
Yes. So they're organisations that the US in particular in this case has confidence in, and they convey that confidence to the Israelis who've accepted it. So that theory is a really sound one, and I believe that the concept is open to cooperation from all the other relief agencies to be able to take advantage of those safe spaces that are created to help get food out. And I mean, that should be the fundamental priority for everybody. Yep. Get the food out. Don't play games with this or actually take sides with Hamas with this. Work together on how, we should have like a civil military operations center that this is highly coordinated through. So I'd hope that the US and Israel can learn the lessons from their first go around, like we did in Somalia. It's not uncommon, particularly in the circumstances where people are desperate. So there's issues on both sides here, but the intent is a good, solid one, actually, I believe, from Israel and the US to get to that result. Safety, security, or relief delivery.
Sounds hopeful.
It should be, but it depends on whether the lessons are learned.
So what is the best way forward for relief in Gaza?
Yeah, look, the best way forward is for everybody to understand we're so much amplified when we work together and coordinate. So, I've got an image here of an ICRC truck which has delivered a tank to be installed in Sarajevo, where I was based, in the ruins, to try and get fuel and water running again for the local population. But there are times when an NGO won't have, like this military gantry here that's lifting these tanks in UN marking, but provided by a member of the contingents there. And there are UN capabilities that can be complementary to NGO capabilities and military capabilities that will just make things reality. So another classic example of that I came across in Somalia was you had Irish Concern had really done a lot of great work around Kismayo in southern Somalia, restoring irrigation ditches to allow farming to recommence. Only problem was they weren't capable of getting the gates working for that irrigation system. So US Army engineers, incredibly capable and well-equipped engineers, they've been involved in a lot of nation building within the United States, came in and made those gates operable, which made the entire irrigation system operable.
Wonderful.
So it's Irish Concern working with the US military to make something happen. So let's look at our capabilities and just match them up and work together. We learn that lesson, we amplify the international capability and the international intent and outcome gets achieved, the holistic end state that we need to peg out there and agree on. And I think that's probably the biggest single missing thing we see a lot at the moment is this kind of whole of capability, whole of government, whole of international community approach to defining what is the holistic end state we seek to achieve, and then crafting everybody's a contribution to getting to that goal and coordinating it effectively. That's not happening because there's too much politics, propaganda, manipulation going on, information warfare, and I'm really sad to see the UN slipping into this. They are now a partisan organisation. They have failed to really promote the potential for peace. I've really seen nothing that's put pressure, for example, on Hamas from the UN to lay down their weapons and release hostages.
Be over overnight.
Yeah, I mean, and setting up maybe mechanisms to sort of advance these causes, and mobilize the international community behind that. So there's a failing going on here, and I include in this that the Israeli government, the IDF, in the early stages of this, needed to have a more refined approach themselves, and they've learnt that lesson. So let's all learn these lessons and work together.
Mm. Yeah, well, thank you for the work that you're doing, Mike, in this program to be able to really clear these things up for people, and hopefully we can build something that's better.
Yeah, well, it's been a life mission for me. It's the main reason why I got into politics in the first place, was to try and get the Civil Military Centre set up here, which is still operating today. So there's so much benefit that I've learned in working together with NGOs and with all of the different players that I hate to see that we're still struggling with that.
Thank you for your work.
No, thanks, Susanna. Well, we'll end it there for this week. As I say, we'll pop up from time to time beyond our normal programming to deal with issues as they occur. So hopefully this has been useful to you. I know many people may disagree, have a different view, but I'd ask people to get beyond the algorithm bias that they may be forming on either side of these debates, and try and open your mind and deal with these issues seriously. So thanks again for being with us, and we'll see you again next time.